So our next speaker and the last speaker of the symposium is Nancy Kanwisher. Nancy is another very distinguished MIT faculty member, and I might add another notable success of MIT's autism recruitment effort, if you will. Nancy is an MIT lifer. She received her undergraduate degree from MIT. She received her PhD from MIT. We let her go for a few years, and then she came back. And now she is the Walter Rosenbluth Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience in Brain and Cognitive Sciences, and also an investigator in the McGovern Institute. She's received many awards. She's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Nancy is well known for revealing specialized regions in the human cerebral cortex that are specialized for specific functions related to visual processing. And in fact, given the specific phenotype of autism, in which specific brain regions are highly likely to be involved, we think it is another lacuna in the field that we have such little understanding of how the phenotype of autism maps to the brain regions and circuitry of autism, some of which you have heard from Anne. And again, Nancy's work is beginning to change our understanding of how we might map specific functions onto specific brain regions and circuits.
Thanks, Morganka, and thanks everyone for still being here. This is the real diehards who are still here. Okay, so I want to talk about attention today, and this is work done by Cami Koldewin in my lab. I'm looking for a pointer. There you go. I have to figure out which part to set this thing here. No?
No, it's actually right up top there.
Oh, boy, you never guess. Okay. So this is work done by Cami Koldewin in my lab with extensive collaboration and intellectual input from Yuhong Zhang at University of Minnesota and lots of other people. And I just want to thank the Simons Simplex Collection and the Autism Consortium for putting us in touch with the subjects and their families, and thanks to the families and the participants in our studies. Okay, so maybe I'll just give you a brief capsule statement of what I'm going to say. I'm going to argue that two of the aspects of attention which have been argued to be impaired in autism may actually not be impaired in autism. It may be that people with autism make different choices of what to attend to rather than having different attentional abilities. So that's going to be my conclusion. But first, oh yes, new data is being uploaded. Isn't that nice? As we speak. That means my team is analyzing data right now. Always nice to know. So what is attention? The key idea of attention is that we experience only a very small subset of the information that comes in through our senses. So if you take vision, for example, there's an eye. There's a torrent of visual information streaming into our eyes all the time. And much of that information is picked up in the retina and sent up to the brain. And the key point here is that only a tiny part of that information is actually processed further by the brain. And what that means is that attention is a key determinant of what we experience, what we respond to, and what we remember. And so you can think of attention as really a fundamental filter of experience. And so, of course, since it exercises such a huge control over so much of cognition, it's important to ask whether it's affected in autism. More data analysis. Isn't that nice to know? I don't know how to turn that thing off. We'll just bear with it. Okay, so as usual, some of the key insights come from just talking to people with autism and watching them. And so here is a video from the Autism Speaks video gallery, and this is just a little segment of the ADOS diagnostic test. And so what you'll see is there's a tester who's off screen here, and she's talking to this child, calling his name several times. The child is playing with a toy. And then when the child does not turn to the tester, the mom tries to solicit the attention of the child, and you see that it doesn't work very well. So here we go. So this is the tester who's talking to the child, calling his name. And he's not turning.
Luke, can you give him to look at you? Luke, look at Mama.
Pretty much a gold medalist. Not looking at these kids.
Hey, Luke, look at Mama. Look, Mama's phone. Oh.
Okay, so after multiple bids for the child's attention, by the tester calling his name, by the mom saying, look at mama, that doesn't work. It's not until she makes a beep on her phone that the kid finally turns his attention. So it sure looks like something's going on with attention here. And of course, there's a huge literature on this, including many aspects of attention. But what I want to consider today is just two different claims that have been made about aspects of attention that may be implicated in autism. So one claim is that people with autism have a difficulty in attending globally to information. So in one of the classic designs, more data analysis, good, okay. In one of the classic designs, you show these compound stimuli like this here. And the claim is that while most typical children and adults looking at this see the large-scale information first, the H, they also see the small-scale information, the claim is that kids with autism are less good at seeing the global information, and they focus on the small details. They see just the S's. And that might not be such a big deal, except that it's further been claimed that this is not just some specific weird glitch of the visual system, but that more generally, kids with autism fail to see the big picture, not only perceptually, but also conceptually. So this is the idea of weak central coherence that was put forth quite a while ago by Ute Frith and Francesca Happe. So that's one idea about how attention may be different in autism. The other one I want to address, which isn't an alternative view, it's just a different claim about attention in autism, is the idea that people with autism have sticky attention. They get stuck on one thing. This is actually related to some of the stuff Anne talked about. But the idea here is it's really the attention system that locks onto one thing and is unable to move on to other things. And so you can see how that might account for stuff like the kid's failure to turn his attention when his name is called. He's focusing on that toy. It's hard to disengage. You can also see how it might lead to things like restricted interests. If you have a tendency to get stuck on one thing, your range of experience will be more limited. Okay, so are these claims true? Let's take this first one. Little teeny bit of background data. One of the sources of evidence for this claim comes from the embedded figures task shown over on the left, where you show a figure like this and a little triangle, and you ask people to find the triangle in that figure. And so there's a paper from Baron Cohen's lab quite a while ago claiming that actually people with autism are faster to find that triangle in here. If you haven't seen it yet, it's right in there. And the idea is they're less fooled by the overall structure, by the concept of the image, and so they can see those little details and they pick out the triangle faster. Well, other studies find actually no difference in embedded figures performance between people with autism and controls, and the literature is a bit messy, but this claim has persisted in the literature. And the other chunk of the literature on this idea of local processing comes from the use of stimuli like this compound figure that I showed before. So, for example, there's a study from Marlene Berman's lab arguing that whereas typical adults process the global information more readily, people with autism process the local information more readily. Again, the literature is pretty inconsistent here, and so we really want to see if we can do a little better to answer it. So in the first study I'll describe, we tested 33 kids with autism spectrum disorder from both the Simons subject group and the Autism Consortium subject pool. They've been confirmed with the ADOS test to be on the spectrum. And we have 33 typically developing control kids who are matched on age. They're all between 5 and 10 years old. They're all matched on sex. They're mostly boys because this is an autism group, 6 girls. They're matched on nonverbal IQ, and all participants have normal or corrected to normal vision. Okay, so the first task we do is very simple. We show kids a display like this, and we ask them which of these bottom 2 shapes matches the top shape. Very simple, that's all we tell them. And so the idea is if they're using the global information, the global big shape, they'll choose this shape. If they're using the local information, they'll choose that shape. Okay, this is a way of just asking in a default way what information is more dominant in the kid's mind. And so the expectation from the literature is that the kids with autism will be more likely to choose the local match on the right. Okay, so what do we see? In fact, that is what we see. So on the y-axis here is the tendency to choose the global match, and you can see the control kids overwhelmingly choose the global match. And the kids with autism are less likely to. They're more in the middle. They're more likely to choose the local match. In fact, the tendency to choose the local match is correlated with autism severity as measured with the ADOS score and an SRS score. Okay, so that's very interesting and consistent with the general claims in the literature. But recall that we just asked the kids to say which one matches. We didn't tell them how to do it. So the fact that the kids with autism do something different here is kind of ambiguous. It could be that they choose to focus on different information or that they are less able to process the global information, and these data don't tell us. So what if we ask them to attend globally or locally? So we do that in the next experiment, where we show them the same kinds of displays, but for a whole block of trials we say, see, there's big shapes and little shapes, and right now I want you to match the big shapes. So that means that the correct response here is to press that button here, and then in a later block we tell them, we want you to match the little shapes, and in that block this is the correct response here. And what we find in that task is that all the kids can do this really well, whether they are ASD kids or typical kids. There's no difference. They're at 97% correct across the board. So they can certainly do the global task. But now there's a subtler measure we can look at. In the same experiment, we actually had two different kinds of trials. So these trials I showed you before are called congruent trials because if you're doing the global match, if information from the local level seeped in, it would lead to the same response. In contrast to the incongruent trials, where there's a conflict between the global information and the local information. So if, for example, kids had a greater tendency to process the local information, then even if they could do the global task, more data analysis, we might find more interference from the local information here on the global task than vice versa. So we can look at reaction time to get this subtler measure of the degree to which irrelevant information from the other level seeps in and interferes with performance. So here's reaction time data from the control subjects here doing the local task and the global task. And what you see is that in both cases, there's a cost of having inconsistent information from the other level. So if they're doing the local task, they're slower if the global information is inconsistent and leads to the opposite response. Same if they're doing the global task. So we see equal interference of both local and global information in the typical kids. So what do we see with the kids with autism? If there's a subtle version of a global bias on this task, we might expect to get more interference from the local level on the global task than vice versa. But we see nothing of the kind. We see overall greater interference, and that's important. That suggests that these kids are less able to selectively attend to the instructed dimension overall, but in terms of this question about local and global processing, there's no difference in their ability to do either task and in the tendency of either kind of information to interfere with the other information. So if you instruct them to do the task, they can do it just as well with local and global. Okay, so in answer to this first question, is there an impairment in global attention or global processing in autism? I'd say, well, no, there isn't. There's a preference to process local information if you give them a choice, but that's a preference. It's not based on a different ability, okay, because when you ask them to do, they can do either. Okay, let's take the second question of sticky attention. Do kids with autism have a greater difficulty disengaging attention from one object to move on to another? So as background, here's a basic design that's been used in lots of studies where you present a stimulus in the center of a screen, and then a second or two later, you present another stimulus in the periphery. This is called the shift condition because the standard thing people do is they fixate here with their eyes, and then when this comes on, they shift their attention and their eyes over to the peripheral stimulus. In contrast, in the disengaged condition, it's exactly the same, except the original stimulus stays on when the second one comes on. So in order to shift your attention to the second stimulus, you also need to disengage from that first stimulus. So the idea is if it takes you longer to shift your gaze over here in the disengaged condition, that's consistent with the idea that your attention is stuck on that first stimulus. And that's the general finding in typical subjects from decades of research on attention and eye movements, that it's harder to disengage attention if the thing you're engaged on is still there. Okay, so that's the basic result. And in fact, in a very widely cited paper by Landry and Bryson in 2004, they showed that with this paradigm here. So here's typical kids doing this task. This is reaction time in the shift condition and the disengage condition. And that increased reaction time is the extra difficulty the typical kids have in disengaging from that stimulus. Okay, as expected. But here's a surprise. What Landry and Bryson claimed is that the kids with autism is a much larger disengage cost here, many-fold or twofold larger than the typical kids. A really huge effect. They're basically stuck on that thing for 2 seconds before they shift. Okay. However, there's a few fishy things about this experiment. One is that they included trials in which the kids never shifted, so they averaged in reaction times of 8 seconds, which doesn't quite make sense. And there's some other funny things about this task. So we just wanted to see if that was true. So first question is this disengaged deficit for real? And second question is, does the disengaged deficit depend on what you're disengaging from? Does it matter what that central stimulus is? In particular, does it matter if it's a face or an object? Because if you think about sticky attention in autism, it makes perfect sense when you think of that kid playing with the toy, getting stuck on the toy, but how often do you hear about kids getting stuck fixating on somebody's face, right? So it seems like it might interact with the nature of the stimulus. Okay, so that's what we did. We showed subjects displays like that. So in the shift condition, just like Landry and Bryson, a stimulus comes on, and then a couple seconds later, a peripheral stimulus comes on. And disengage is the same, except the central stimulus stays on. So we have subjects look at these stimuli while we're tracking their eyes with an eye tracker. And importantly, we give them no specific instructions or task. We want to know where they look, what their attention system chooses to attend to, not whether they can follow our instruction in this case. So we have children with autism, typical children and adults in this task. We have a shift and a disengaged condition, and we vary the nature of the stimuli from both the original stimulus and the next stimulus both being non-social, non-faces, to having the original one being non-social and the second one being social, a face, or vice versa. So that's our design. So here's the data from adults. This is now reaction time. Let me go back and show you. It's the amount of time after this stimulus comes on before you launch a saccade, an eye movement, from this stimulus to that stimulus. So how long does it take you to start moving your eyes after that second stimulus comes on? So here you can see the typical disengage effect in typical adults. The reaction time to launch that saccade is longer when the first stimulus stays on than when it goes away, as expected. You see the same thing in typical kids. So now the question is, will we see, as Landry and Bryson did, a much greater disengagement cost with the kids with autism? Answer, no. They're just like the typical kids. There's no greater disengagement cost in our data. Their ability to disengage attention is just like that of typical kids and adults. But does this depend on the nature of the stimulus? This is now non-social to non-social, object to object. What happens when we have different stimuli? Okay, so now what I'm going to show you next is just the difference between these two conditions. So we're going to plot the disengagement cost, the greater reaction time for the disengaged condition versus the shift condition. So the black bars are those differences in the data I showed you before, disengaged cost. And you can see for the adults and the typical kids that it's a bit noisy, but it doesn't seem to depend really clearly on the nature of the stimuli from object to object, object to face, and face to object. There's no really strong effects. What do we see for the kids with autism? Here's what we see. It's the same, except for this critical condition of shifting from a face to a non-face. There's no disengagement cost at all. And this is astonishing. I mean, decades of research has used this disengagement cost as a fundamental property of attention. And here we see that that disengagement cost just doesn't even exist for kids with autism if they're leaving a face. So that's pretty surprising. And now we might wonder, is that an inability to engage on the face in the first place? Maybe they just have a problem locking on the face, and so they were never engaged, and so it's easy to disengage. Or is it just a preference given the choice between a face and object to leave the face? Well, we can get a clue about that by doing another analysis of the same data. We can ask, before the second stimulus ever comes on, this thing is on for a couple of seconds. Once they fix their eyes on it, do they leave early before the second one comes on? And are they more likely to do that if it's a face than a non-face? So here is the data if it's a non-face, like this kiwi fruit comes on. And so what this shows is the percent of trials in which they move their eyes away from this before that stimulus comes on. Only about 2.5% of trials. Not very often, and no different for kids with autism and typical kids. So what happens if that stimulus is a face? Well, no different. So what that says is the kids with autism are not just unable to attend to a face and to engage on a face. They're no more likely to look away from the face if there's no competing stimulus. So what it is when there's a competing stimulus that comes on, they quickly disengage from the face and go to the non-face when given that choice. But it's not that they couldn't attend to the face in the first place. Okay. So I started with these two claims about the nature of attention in autism and proposed deficits in attention in autism. And I'd argue that in both of these cases, people with autism show not disabilities, but simply different attentional preferences. Now, to say that they're different preferences rather than different abilities doesn't mean they're not important. It could be that preferences matter just as much, but they're importantly different. We really need to know which these are. Different preferences could have profound consequences because, as I mentioned at the beginning, attention determines pretty much everything in experience and all of cognition. And so if you have a different preference for what to attend to, it will have the same huge impact on everything you process. Okay, so that's very nice, but of course at the deepest level, what we really want to know is not just which of these phenomena are affected and which aren't in autism. What we really want to know is whether these and other aspects of attention play a causal role in the development of autism. So just as a simple-minded illustration of this, we can imagine models, this is very simple, but just to give you the idea, where you might imagine that kids with autism may start with some very early developing atypicality in the way they attend to the world, either preferences or abilities, and that could lead to other phenomena, such as social cognitive deficits. If you're not attending to the right things, you may just never bootstrap your social cognitive system correctly. It may lead to restricted interests, and those in turn could lead to autism. So that's one very simplified but possible story where critically attention is playing a causal role in the etiology of autism. But we might also imagine other kinds of models where you start with some other more fundamental deficit, perhaps an early developing social cognitive deficit that leads to other phenomena where here atypical attention is just an offshoot. It's a side effect. It's a consequence of autism rather than a cause of autism. So I think these are really the deep questions about the cognitive phenotype that need to be answered. And unfortunately, my data don't allow me to answer them, although I'll give you a teeny bit of a clue in a second. But the point is that these have very different implications for remediation. If you found a way to remediate attention here, that would have profound effects. And if this is the real situation in the world, it's a symptomatic treatment, not a deep treatment. Okay. So how are we ever going to answer this? I don't know. It's tough. I just point to it because it's important. We get a teeny bit of a clue from our data. The data I've talked about today are just a tiny subset of what we're actually testing, which is a huge battery of different behavioral and neuroimaging measures where we test many different aspects of perceptual abilities, attentional abilities, executive function abilities, and I ran out of space, but an equal number of social cognitive tasks and language tasks, along with an extensive 2-session MRI battery to try to really get a comprehensive measure profile on each kid. And importantly, each kid goes through this whole battery, which is why it's such a heroic contribution on the part of the kids and their families to participate in these studies. And so the hope is that because we have each of those measures on each kid, we will start to get some clues about which of these things are connected to each other. So for example, if we find that a given difference in attention is correlated with some of these other aspects of the cognitive phenotype of autism that might suggest a causal relationship. So far, our data suggests no correlation between that preference for local information that I mentioned first in my talk and either theory of mind abilities or face perception abilities, both of which are clearly impaired in many people's data, including ours. So that suggests that, that it's not playing a causal role here, but there's much more to be done. And the final thing I want to say is that, of course, as has been already remarked a number of times in here, and as all of you know well, autism is an extremely heterogeneous disorder. So I've just talked about the group results here. What does a general group trend show in our subject population? But actually, our hope with this very demanding for us and for our subjects battery is that we will discover some structure in this disorder from the patterns of co-occurrences of the different phenomena, both behavioral and neuroimaging. And if we discover clusters or subgroups or dimensions of variation of the disorder, that will be significant progress. Thank you.